Hello, everybody. So I am here to talk about having difficult conversations with family or friends or people in your community as we are getting close to the holiday season. We just had a huge thing happen in America that the world all has opinions on. And no matter what side you're on, you have a reason for the way you voted and you have a reason to believe what you believe. And there is validity in that, even if it doesn't make sense to other people. And there's no way that we are going to be able to get rid of racism or ableism or sexism if we don't keep learning and talking to each other about it. So, this episode, we are going to talk about different resources and different things to keep in mind when you're having these conversations with people in your community. So, first, I want to say that this podcast is sponsored by Reading and Learning. If I didn't take the time to read all of my books that I love to read, I can't even imagine the kind of human that I would be. And I'm going to give you mini summaries about the books that I'm recommending during this podcast because each one is so important to me and has just given me such a great insight into why people don't think the way that I think. Because obviously I think the way that I think is great. But not everyone is going to agree with the same thing that I am. And it would also be boring if we all agreed, if we all had the same opinions. The point is that we are supposed to expand our inner circles, learn from each other, change our minds, rethink things, and grow together and figure out what the next step is into being a more inclusive community, a kinder community, a smarter, stronger, more awesome community. Okay, so this podcast episode all started because obviously there was a big election. I'm recording this in November 10th. And the first time I attempted to record this was a few days ago. And it was a big election. There's a lot of posts coming out. There's a lot of hate coming out. That is just not okay. And it's important that we keep talking to each other and not further cut our ties and become such a divided country. And I know a lot of people will sit there and say, you voted against me. I'm not important to you. And if you talk to the people who did vote differently than you, they very strongly believe that that's not what they voted for. They weren't voting towards hate. And the only way for both of us to understand each other is to talk about it. So I also want to talk about the whole quote, we can agree to disagree. I try really hard not to say that because even though we could disagree with each other, and a lot of us will disagree with each other, that should never be the ending to an argument. Or a discussion, that we just agree to disagree. Because instead of finding steps to communicate and to understand where the other person is coming from, that means that we have to keep working on it. Ending a conversation with, we'll just agree to disagree is like shutting off a piece of ourselves towards each other, which is just not what we want. And I do think conversations are needed to understand each other, and that we're not going to be able to change our minds or have the opportunity to rethink our goals and values without surrounding ourselves with other opinions and other different types of people. Because if we're only surrounded by all the people that agree with us, again, it just it keeps that separation just too big. And it might right now might not be the best time. This is fresh. This is new. This just happened. You don't have to just start conversations. I mean, you are allowed to grieve and feel your emotions and feel your feelings now. And don't force yourself to do anything that you're not comfortable or wanting to push yourself to do. But I can tell you the conversations are so worth it because I have had a lot of these hard conversations and I continue to put myself out there to have these conversations because I want to understand where other people are coming from, and I want them to understand where I'm coming from. Another post that I keep seeing a lot of is just like how this two-party system is like tearing our country apart. And sadly, I don't really feel like there's a huge change that's going to happen anytime soon with that. But what we can do as individuals is not let that break us apart. And I'm not saying go to like a group that is going to go over values that you don't agree with. I'm talking about right here, the holidays, maybe having conversations with your parents or your friends or your family. And we're going to talk about different ways to do that and not feeling so afraid to do that. Because this isn't going in for a debate meeting or debate club thing. This is, I think we need to first go into these conversations as like, I want to understand where you're coming from. And I hope that you can also take the time to understand where I'm coming from. There is a lot of vulnerability in this. So another thing that I think is really important before going into these conversations is that media is biased. Everything has its own biases. We all have our own biases, even if we don't really understand where they come from. So when we are having these conversations, I do think it is really important and respectful to like understand what propositions are saying, what policies people are going for, and not calling them what the Republican and Democrat media outlets might be calling them, because they do change the name for whatever reason. And it's important to go into these conversations with like the actual facts to talk about. So personally, I mean, I like to look up things that like the candidate, on their website or wherever, like what their proposed plan is. I do like to look at that information to be able to talk about that information. And oh my gosh, we are in the world of having our phones. Like it is so easy for someone to say what someone's doing, and you can say, I haven't heard about that. Let's look it up real quick. Because that shuts down so many disagreements that people have. Because once you start breaking it down, then you start understanding different things that have been coming out on this topic that like aren't always necessarily true or like kind of skewed. And this goes to both parties. And I'm also saying this as someone who grew up with a Republican and a Democrat parent. I grew up hearing both sides of everything, and hearing the problems with both sides and hearing why both sides are so great, and being told, like what I should believe. And we are going to get to how to talk to children about politics towards the end. But I feel like because I grew up hearing both sides so often, hearing the positive and the negative of both sides, it has kept me to be really open-minded about different candidates and propositions and policies, to create my own set of beliefs, which I think is what we should all be doing. And I kind of said this before, but I just really want to say this again before I start going into all the tips that I have picked up from all the books that I've read. If you don't feel like you can see your family this holiday season because of political differences, or if you don't feel safe, if you don't feel heard, if you don't feel loved, you don't have to see them. And I know it might make the holidays look really different for you, but it's just something that like you need to keep yourself safe. You are the person who's going to do that. And you can decide to create those boundaries. That's okay. You are allowed to do that. Which brings me to my first book, Set Boundaries, Find Peace by Nedra Glover Tawwab. I think that's how you say her last name. I'm not totally sure. But she's also on Instagram. She has such great tips about boundaries, and I just really appreciate all of her tools. She has each chapter is broken down by like boundaries with family, friends, yourself, your job, technology, exercise. It just goes through all these different topics. She has examples. My only critique is that some of the examples are really cheesy, and I personally would never use them. Like some of them. But that doesn't mean it didn't give me a starting point of where to go to create a boundary that made sense to me, or that used the language that like I would use. So she does a lot of great like examples and like ways to navigate it, like really good tips. And so one, I guess the example I'm going to use is if you are talking to someone, even if it's on the phone or in person, and maybe you decide that you don't want to talk about politics, you don't want to talk about the election, and like, you know, directly. And if someone starts talking about the election to you, you can say, hey, you know what? Like, I'm still trying to figure out my emotions with the election. I really don't feel comfortable talking about it right now. So can we talk about something else? If they continue talking about it or make you feel bad, you can say, you know, if you're going to continue to do this, I'm going to put my headphones in and listen to something else, or I'm going to get up and walk away. Making it really clear that if you don't respect this boundary, this is what I'm going to do. And that is a lot of what Nedra's book is about. Someone also recommended The Book of Boundaries by Melissa Urban. It is the next book that I'm going to be listening to, so I'll probably post about it on social media once I actually listen to it, but I've been told it's really good. Next, Think Again by Adam Grant. This is really changing our mindset about how we can rethink our values, our goals, our plan. You know, people are like, what's your 10-year plan? And it's fun, you know, it's like nice to try to have a plan, but it's also okay to change. It's also okay to admit that you were wrong, because now you're closer to being right. And there's a whole chapter about talking to people. I think it's chapter 7, if you want to get real specific. I could be wrong. The chapter is about anti-vaxxers. But it's a great example of like having those good conversations. And that brings me to Blair Imani, who is the founder of Smarter in Seconds. And she did a great visual. I'll try to like add it somewhere because I think everyone needs to see it. But it's really great tips of like, you know, going in to share your message, not to change minds, and listening with the intention not to respond in silence, that it's an active participation conversation. Respecting boundaries. Just like I said, you create boundaries. If someone else creates boundaries, respect that. And then speaking from personal experiences, saying, you know, I feel really hurt that this happened because I'm afraid of this. Like, that vulnerability is really important. And then being patient. It's okay to stop and come back and revisit the conversation. And, you know, really reflecting on what you even got from that first conversation. The next book I want to talk about is You're Not Listening by Kate Murphy. I recommend this book to so many people. It is about active listening, and I don't think I understood how poorly of a listener I was. And one of her examples is when you're like, hey, I'm Kayla, what's your name? And then they say it, but you're already in your head like, oh, I like their shirt. I'm going to compliment them on their shirt. And then they're like, so where do you work? And you're like, oh man, I missed your name. Like, can you say it again? And then again, your brain starts thinking like, oh, good, I'm glad I asked for their name again. That's great. And then they start talking again and you're like, I didn't listen to it again. And so it gives tools on active listening. And my favorite tool is that you're not thinking of a response before they're done answering or talking, so that you are concentrating on everything that they're saying. And then once their sentence ends, giving yourself the time to respond. People don't like awkward silences anymore, or maybe ever, but that's okay. Like, you know, count to 5 in your head after you say something before you're about to start talking again. So I love to focus on all of these books have taught me things on when I'm having conversations with people, especially when we are disagreeing on a topic. So my favorite few tips from all these is that, like, I really want to understand where the person is coming from. And how I do that is I ask them to define the terms that they're using. So if they're like, you know, well, you're so focused on inclusion, but like, you don't really seem to talk about the LGBTQ plus community a lot. And like, you're really more focused on disability inclusion. And I'm like, oh yeah, you're totally right. And then we can have a conversation about me defining the area of inclusion that I'm in. That doesn't mean I don't want, you know, people of color or the LGBTQ plus community or women. Like, it's not that I don't want them included. And I do also try to focus on all of those different areas as well. But where my focus is and where I teach people is like through education, and that's with the disabled community, because that's just what I know. Anywho, defining the terms is just really like, and I do this with both my parents, I do this with my friends, I do this with my everyone. If they're saying something that I don't really agree with, sometimes I ask them to define the term that I feel like they're using incorrectly, because maybe the way that they're using it is changing what the outcome is. That feels like it makes sense in my head, so I hope that makes sense to you. So also, I think what's really important is recognizing what the discussion is about and don't let it get off track. Now, this is something I learned in this book called Marriage Rules. I don't have the author. Me and my partner read it before we got married. And one of the best things was like, if I come up to my partner and I'm like, it feels like you don't do the dishes very often and you just keep stacking them there and it's really overwhelming to me. He cannot respond by saying, oh, well, you know what? I took out the trash and it's really exhausting that you don't do that. Because now he's bringing up another argument. How we need to handle it is that I brought up my concern. We are going to talk about the dishes. If we feel like there's an imbalance with chores, then that would be the next conversation that we could talk about, to like find a solution. And I feel like I use this a lot with discussions with people. So it's like, if I'm talking about something, usually people will throw in some random topic and I'm like, okay, that's also an area that we can talk about, but this original thought is what I want to talk about. And I feel like that takes practice to also be able to notice and to call out on and be like, hey, let's back up and actually talk to that first thing that we were talking about. So another tip that I have is talking about how you feel, being vulnerable, not just saying this candidate sucks because of X, Y, Z. You can say, I feel worried that this candidate's policies aren't thinking about me. And when you voted for them, it makes me feel like you don't care about my rights. That is something that is so much more meaningful. And I don't know what parent would be able to look at their kid or friend be able to look at someone they call a genuine friend and say like, well, that's why I voted for them, like whatever. So embrace that vulnerability. I always get so winded during these episodes. Another great tip in the Marriage Rules book was we don't say never or always. So no candidate never does this or always does this. That is just not part of the conversation. If someone, and I'm the very annoying person when it comes to this, if someone uses never or always with me, I respond with, whoa, you've never had to do that ever, or you've always done that, like you've never forgotten. Because usually they'll be like, okay, well, yeah, not always. And it's just like a little mindset reminder, mind shift of like, okay, it feels like this happens a lot and that's why it's frustrating. And again, understanding just like everyone has their own perspectives. I think actually a lot about that duck show, the duck hunting show, where it was those four men from somewhere in middle America hunting ducks or something. And the grandpa of the three men, who was like in his 80s or something, said that he, they all go to church and very religious, and he doesn't support gay marriage. And that basically canceled the show. And to me, I was like, why are people shocked that he's against gay marriage? He grew up being told it was a sin. I mean, things that you learn as a kid, that sticks with you. And he's 80. He's had 80 years of thinking it's a sin. Him talking about how he's feeling and then being canceled for it doesn't change his mind. If anything, it's going to dig his heels in more. Like, well, obviously you people aren't as inclusive because you couldn't even talk to me about, this topic. Which again, I just feel like it's so important that we talk it out with everyone. Okay, so what can we do? This is the first election that I think I've really turned around from it and just saying, you know what, I need to do more. I do vote. I call my representatives when there's something I want them to vote on. I go to protests, not so much since having kids and COVID, but used to go to a lot of protests. I sign petitions, I vote, I do the things that I feel like are kind of the bare minimum. And I know that I kept telling people that I just don't really feel like I could do much more. Like, what else am I going to do as a one person? Well, I've decided to change my view on that and rethink what I can do as a single person. And because disability inclusion is such a passion of mine and raising inclusive kids, I am deciding to focus on my school board in my district and see how I can get involved to actually make systemic change in my school system that I'm a part of. And anybody can do this. Everybody is welcome to their school board meetings. And this is something that we can all do. We can all volunteer. We can all be a part of nonprofits that share the same mission and values that we are in. There are ways to get involved and to do things in our community and make change. Again, the calls, the letters, the protests, those are all things that we can do as well. And then supporting companies that are giving money to organizations you support. I know this one's a little hard for me sometimes because I don't always agree with how companies are spending their money. But I try really hard to support the companies. I mean, I really try to support small business and good secondhand stuff and people selling their clothes. But I'm also a consumer in America, and so it's a little hard sometimes, still working on it. Now, last thing I want to talk about is how to raise inclusive kids and how this election has kind of got me thinking about how I want to talk to my kids about voting, about politics, about people who disagree. And something that I don't think everyone's going to agree with is that we didn't talk negatively about the candidate that won. We did not call him a bully. We did not say that he's just this mean, evil person. Because I understand that my kids are learning a lot from me, and that is whatever my own opinion and biases are, is not something I want to force on them. What we did talk about is how we felt after the election, is that we felt like it didn't go the way we wanted it to go, but we do hope that there can be some sort of success in the next 4 years. We talked about being kind to people and the importance of our actions every day at school and at work and online. My kids kind of understand that I have this online presence, but I'm not quite sure how much they get, how many people listen to me. I don't think I understand how many people listen to me. But this election had us talk a lot about treating people, like talking about women and talking about, the right to vote and talking about people of color and not treating people differently because of their skin and talking about disabilities and how we can be an ally to all of these different groups that are out there and just learning from people. I think a lot of fear comes from the unknown, which seems to be just the theme of the last few podcasts. And we can learn. We have the availability. We have the option to learn. We have so many resources out there. We have so many things that we can do. Really, if I can give you anything, like write down 3 priorities for the next 4 years for you, and how are you going to make a difference there? So I hope this helped. I realized I recorded this already, and I'm not sure if I'm going to be jumping around or not. This is going to be weird to edit the day before I'm posting it. Thank you, everyone who's here listening. And no matter who you voted for, I always want to be open to have a conversation with you so we can learn from each other and grow and rethink maybe how we feel about certain things. Because inclusion starts with you, and it starts now. And I just want to help. Whew. Okay, I'm winded. Have a good day.